I'll go ahead and share my screen as well.
I figured you were going to have like pre-recorded messages that came out every Monday night for the next 3 or 4 weeks, with the proclamation,
I should have it by memory at this point.
Yeah.
All right. Or maybe we can say it together right now. Just teasing. We won't go back to our all in unison days here. Okay, so as we're getting started, this is our post-secondary readiness and business group. And it's our 6th meeting, so I'll go ahead and read our proclamation. Our conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments, and you've been reviewing those in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comments encouraged on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula, considering what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations, while committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly. Public documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. So thank you again for bearing with me, and certainly for all your hard work on this, on our work for a public school funding formula. I will, in Dr. Boyd's absence, I will just kind of toggle through and kick it to you all for questions. Our agenda today, as I indicated earlier and in our last call, this is our meeting 6. We'll have discussion and follow-ups from, let Andy in, from our meeting 5. So I'll pull forward the comments and the recommendations that were made from the group, and we'll have our draft formula up as well so we can review that. Hi, Andy, how are you? And then we can also then toggle through any of those policies. Not every policy that's there would be something you would want to necessarily weigh in on. It definitely just thinking from the perspective of the post-secondary and readiness group. So thinking from your perspectives, and that'll be our meeting. So I will move us over to layering all the things again. So Dr. Ricker, I'll kind of kick it to you a little bit too, and well, in the group, just to any areas we would want to walk through. We spent time last week on our draft funding framework. So this is the framework for our funding proposal, and with some of the objectives that it's strategic for all students, easy to understand, sustainable, outcomes driven, and flexible. Okay, Lisa's coming in. So if you can see this okay, I will. Hey Lisa, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Sorry I'm a little late.
Fine. We just read the proclamation, and we have the draft funding framework for our formula up, and we're going to toggle through some of the recommendations and things that we pulled forward at our last meeting. So and the objective for this meeting would be to any final iterations, thinking about what else you would want to include. And then we will also, there are several policy questions I'll slide over so that you can see those. But I thought you all did a great job last week of talking through some of those. So I'll hand it over to you. If anyone have any questions or any other considerations around some of the base. And I'll Well, here we had those prioritized. I don't think you added anything to those. Those were in red last week. So hearing none. Thinking about the weights, again, those are layered on over the base. So a student would then be able to layer in each of those if they're poverty and rural. So additional weights for students. These were the categories. So we had poverty and concentrated poverty, rural, and the heavy and moderate, those were the prioritized areas. So if we had more of a weighted value on an area based on feedback from the subcommittees and the steering committee. Okay, in our discussions last time, you all really didn't have anything else to add to that. I don't know if you've thought on it or if there's more that for consideration. I'll give space for that.
Hey, Janice, just a quick question. There was a brief conversation last time about trying to blunt the statistical variation that might occur from one year to the next. If there's 3% more students in a given school, and then that drops again by 4%, just kind of normal deviations. Do we want to create a range or a bandwidth in which those administrators could assume that their funding is the same unless there's a variation above a certain threshold? I couldn't remember exactly if that applied to the base or if it applied to another function of the formula, but I believe we discussed that in meeting 5.
Okay, let's find that. Was that mentioned? I heard that conversation here. Tell me more. In the
it's down under policy deviation thresholds. It's further down in the document.
Okay.
They're right there. You got it.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Is there a range to consider? Or how would you want that worded, or what are you thinking?
Well, I guess the reason I brought it up is my understanding was that would be intended to apply to the base calculation. Yeah, and exactly what that range might be, I would suggest we leave that to others to determine. But our suggestion just being trying to create a situation where a 1% change isn't causing everybody to have to reconfigure a budget in a given year.
Gotcha. Yeah. Gotcha. So do you think that should also be noted up in the weighted value, or you said it's applied to the base? So adding that up to the base? Yeah.
One of the things that I was looking at from a base, and I don't know where this actually lies, but when you think of all the supplies and instructional materials, I'm sure there's a high demand on where those dollars are being spent to be grabbed up by different vendors. How is that measured, and how is that weighted to the point to where we're confident that it's being used for the students in the right way? I mean, how is that being done?
That's a good question. So I think it goes back to, so were you looking at that from the
base standpoint, where it talks about that, but yeah.
I think when we were talking about if a textbook has been adopted, then each child should have their own and their own workbook. We're not talking about extra things, but if it's the adopted curriculum, then they should all have access to it.
Okay.
Yeah, so do you see that? Did we write that here? Help me scan. I can add that. Instructional supplies. Yeah, so this is still following, this funding would still follow the, it's a funding plan versus a spending plan. So having that flexibility, but I like that it's pointed here. So any instructional supplies for, so funding maybe some specific wording. So is it direct funding? That is a category as well. Let me double check. Did we see it here?
Should you say adopted textbooks or?
And that may be that it would fit. So that I'll copy that and put it maybe in this section. Let's see here. So direct funding that would support, to your point, the text. Well, we put textbooks, materials, students by grade level. Is there any additional, anything else there that could clarify that? But that may be a better suited place, is that it's in the base, but it's also identified in a direct funding.
Yeah, I just think it's like, what bumpers or rails do you put around to make sure that it's guarded so that it's being used for what the real intent is, and just making sure that, if the dollars follow the student and the ability for textbooks to be provided, and that's all they can provide, but they cost XYZ here, and then somehow they're able to do something different at another location, but is it the same across the board? That's where my head goes.
Okay. Ensuring all students have, is the right word? I don't know that I heard you say equitable, but would that be the right? Okay.
Yep.
All right, and I may find a better color that stands out. Red was last week, so I'll get a new color. Yeah. Great. So that would go in the direct funding, and we mentioned CTE was also noted here, as well as the base, but not every student would be accessing those funds, a kindergarten student, so pulling it forward for direct funding and to support those high demand and high value opportunities that we're trying to enable and work toward for students. I think you all mentioned several things.
So is it worded in such a way that when they get the money, they have to spend it on textbooks, or are they getting a pot of money that they turn around and say, well, we've always done this where we shared textbooks or we bought a classroom set. So I think to your point earlier, like, well, we've got all this money, but we're still going to buy X, how is it guarded, or how can we ensure that it gets to the hands of the students, in other words, that it doesn't fit the same pattern that we've been facing?
Yeah, kind of on that note, just real briefly, there's a document that was put out. It's called the Handbook for Computation for the BEP, and I'm just going to read it real quick because I think it addresses this issue. It says the only earmark within the formula is on instructional and classroom funds. Funds generated by the instructional components of the formula must be spent on instruction. So this is the BEP formula. So historically, there was an earmark. I guess the question then for this group is, would that earmark function still apply or not? If I'm understanding Mr. Davis's question correctly, he's suggesting that there should be an earmark function, perhaps similar to how the BEP was originally structured. Is that correct, Mr. Davis?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So, and from what I understand, everything that is current in the BEP will be moving forward. So unless it would be a change in policy. So I think that's a great point. So so this, I think, is saying we want to continue with that earmarked function.
I think it's just worth noting for them to consider. I think the issue is that the BEP formula, with its 46 different factors, would have specifically called out a portion of a formula for instructional material, whereas the new program would not. I could see our suggestion just being, hey, is this something that the department would want to consider, is to maintain some designation. But I don't know that we'd want to get into the weeds beyond that because it's structurally, it's going to be quite a bit different than the way that the BEP factor would have been applied.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, as long as it's different, it may just be that it wasn't fully funded or there wasn't enough money there, but I know there are kids that are not getting textbooks and not getting materials in their hands. So throw out whatever we were doing before because it wasn't working, but the concept, I agree with you of, it may just be that they didn't have enough money, so then they had to choose, you know, what they could and what they couldn't.
Okay. Yeah.
This is just a quick question that I have just as a parent. So if there's funding, which there's been funding, I do know that there are teachers that purchase things with their own funds. Is it because the funding is not being allocated appropriately, or the teachers just wanting to go over and above? I've always been under the assumption that they've had to purchase some things for their students, for their classrooms. And so there's not a fund for that.
Right. I think there's a designation. There is a designation for textbooks, instructional supplies, but to, I think, Anita's point, it's just not necessarily enough. There are an abundance of needs or manipulatives. There are just a lot of resources at times that, just thinking about math in particular, there are lots of manipulatives and resources that you might need at different grade levels. And so those costs are different across for materials and grade levels. Yeah, so that is an instructional burden.
I know they did not have textbooks in a fourth grade science class. They had a classroom set that they all shared. So if you were out and had to take a book home, then you know you didn't have enough for the classroom. So some of the PTAs, booster clubs have gotten involved and tried to supplement a little bit. They have a workbook and they make copies out of the workbook, but each kid doesn't have their own workbook. So then the teacher's standing at the copier and then it's running up the copy supplies. Then their copier budget is decreased, and so then they have no copy paper. So then the teachers go out and buy their own copy paper. So that's a real life story. Not to mention all the other things that she's bought, but I help her do her income tax, and she'll typically spend $1,000, $1,500 a year to supplement her classroom because she feels like she needs it, and to go over and above, she's not the only one doing it. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. I know when they adopt materials and textbooks, you can oftentimes part of the offer or the deal is to have online access and then a classroom set of materials. And it's thinking that you would be able to access that, remotely and in different ways. And that maybe a classroom set is all that's needed. So part of that's vendor options as well. So it's a good point of the.
You may have done that, and at that particular point in time didn't have one-to-one technology access. So
yeah,
that still didn't help much.
Yep. I
totally
feel that.
Maybe it's ordered to where the points.
Yeah.
Are we down to policy yet on the?
Yeah. And how about I pull over? So just to make sure I don't miss any, I can pull over the document. We really worked off of this one, and as we addressed them, I had pulled it over and made notes. So this was the list of all the policies, and it was in our Google link as well. You're wanting to pull forward the CTE.
Well, and I apologize, I didn't make the last call, okay. But when I look at policy, I'm specifically thinking around CTE, accountability has to be something we achieve from our instructors that are in the CTE, but also from the administrators that are overseeing this. And so if funding is going to follow that, my question is the policy, is there a way to create a policy that would allow for funding and incentivized to instructors that have completion? And I'm going to share a link, and I saw this through an AP. I think Florida does this, advanced placement policies, where they allow for, if you have certain individuals students that complete, there's $50 and it gets capped and increases based on the completion rate. I don't know if there's a way that we could do something like that around CCDE. As a business leader and understanding the challenge, I don't think we have our instructors motivated or incentivized to try to get completers. And we ultimately are getting individuals that only get through level 1, 2, and 3. Is there a way to incentivize our instructors and those that are teaching those classes to help do that if they knew that there was some reward for that?
Yeah, for sure. And I wanted to pull over this one. Yeah, ER, let it fix me. Thank you. On our outcomes, let's look here. Yeah, there were several. Does this speak to kind of what you're getting at as well? For the outcomes, that's definitely providing, there's Nicole coming in, that's providing, to your point, that incentivized financial resource to the district to help support that increase of that accountability metric and the completers. They had several ready graduate indicators listed here. So just something with data source, existing data, which could fall in any of the ready graduate categories, which is completing your ACT metric, or for early post-secondary. It can be a mixture of post-secondaries, 2 post-secondaries plus industry certifications and credentials. And I like what you're saying around CTE completers here.
Right. But is there a way to is there a way to create incentives for the actual instructors based on their district or where they are to increase those numbers? It's one thing, and they get the district gets it by the number of, but what does that formula look like, and how does that really relate down to the teacher themselves? And we have struggles getting attracting, right, the instructors that are there. So if Florida is pulling in AP folks, they actually weight them. I believe how this is written is how I interpret it, is they're actually weighting it to districts that are in underserved areas that have more challenges. They actually have a higher incentive, those AP teachers, if they increase the number that complete those classes, to get the college credits. So maybe everybody can take a look at this and read it, but I shared it in the link. But it's, I don't know if other people have familiarity with this or if Tennessee has anything like this, but.
Maybe it's not a part of their annual salary, but it's more like a stipend or a bonus.
It's a bonus. Yeah, it's best way is to say and it says a $50 bonus for each student taught by an AP course who receives a score of 3 on their AP exam. So, I mean, it's not like it's a lot, but it adds up when you talk about our teachers at the end of the day. What helps motivate them to help, especially in the CTE space, which I don't think I've seen. But when I saw this, I was like, how do you transfer it over to our career technical?
So just just adding a little bit of context there in the link that we're referencing.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
About increasing accountability, right? At the end of the day. I mean, it's outcomes, but it's increasing that accountability.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great idea. It could be fleshed out further. I like that.
Along that same line with CTE, is there money for professional development to help them keep track of latest and greatest? Some districts and systems have that. Some pay out of their pocket on their own to go to different things. So.
Yeah. So professional development, I saw that mentioned from another group.
CTE in STEM classes or.
So, and to better get to your point there, just professional development. Say that again. I know it's recorded. I can go back, but.
Just professional development funding for like CTE classes, STEM classes. to help them keep track of the latest and greatest.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they can be doing a great job, but as technology changes, they need to have updates and upgrades and able to go to conferences or whatever. That makes it really difficult.
Cutting edge, staying on top of it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. Yeah, and to that point, some of the innovative, there are innovative grants and such, but then how to provide, what I hear you saying, more professional development opportunities for across the board. But yeah, nice. And let's see, we can go back to outcomes, because I don't think I see it written in that way there. Nice. Additional considerations that were coming out of subcommittees and the steering committee, we noted. I think we may have looked through this last time. I'm not sure if we came down to the below the content there. Pre-K, we've talked about the importance of that, and I think that made the top 5 cut here, top 2, and I've heard that across many groups, so that's important.
Which, as we're talking about the accountability for the teachers, that's even more important, that you start earlier with the students, because it's easy to just pick out a faculty member at this point in time in the kid's education and say you need to do better, when you get kids that haven't been prepared all along. And so that teacher in one district with students that are less prepared, or they're working harder to achieve the extra stipend or whatever, because they already have kids coming into their system, at a deficit. So if there's the funding across the board, that regardless of where you live and what your zip code is, you have a strong pre-K foundation, then hopefully we can achieve that equity that we talk about.
Well, yeah, I think I hear you saying that under the bullet, but under the outcome section as well.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so incentivizing, that kind of connects back to one of the policy questions around how to support those early grades.
That's right.
Yeah. Heavily weighted investment in pre-K is critical. Yeah. And so then I hear you connecting it also to the outcomes. So
that's right.
Maybe additional funding, or just ensuring that it's a more robust offering. I hear that we're often like our VPK, a voluntary pre-K program, is also needs-based, so that's limiting. So yeah, that's
just across the board, because again, we're looking at a point in time. A teacher needs to be held accountable, but who are the students this teacher is serving and trying to educate? And so we're looking across the board, which is what this, as we talked about last week, this is good, the incentives, but you have a level playing field.
Yeah.
Playing field has not been level.
Nice. Yep. And what color did I choose?
And then the next one, where it talked about accountability and incentivizing for % of students performing at grade level every year. And that same kind of vein off of what Dr. Hall's talking about right there, I guess. I worry about some of our communities and some of our districts that really are challenged. And when you say percentage, is that equitable, and is that already putting them at a disadvantage if right now only 34% of third graders are, at their reading level? How do you deal with that in some of our districts across the state? And when we use a percentage of students performing at grade level, and we use that term, there has to be some variation for the population.
So you're getting at that growth metric? Is that what I'm hearing? Being able to provide
Social economical challenges that maybe one district has over another. And if they're going to be incentivized to be at a certain grade level every year, and they're already challenged, we just took funding away from them to make it even worse.
Mm-hmm.
So one option would be to create kind of a dual mechanism. You know, one would incentivize a floor. So in other words, a certain percentage. Once they arrive at that percentage, then they're eligible for the additional funding. But then also have the growth metric, which I heard Ms. Fox kind of referencing. So in other words, not assume that it has to be one or the other. Could it be both? So if you have if you have a school system that's chronically underperforming, as Mr. Davis has suggested, will be the case in some areas, as long as they can show a certain growth or improvement over the course of time, they too are eligible, even if they're below that threshold. But once they hit that threshold, then it flips and they're eligible because they arrived at that floor, not because of necessarily the growth threshold. Would that be something, Mr. Davis, that would address your concern?
Absolutely. Yeah, just thinking around some of our students in Shelby County and some of the schools that I've had the pleasure of being in, and it's going to take a while to get there. And day one, it's going to be hard to get the needle to move the way it needs to.
Yeah, so that makes me think about both growth and achievement. So having multiple metrics. So our current accountability, so pulling off of our current accountability model that has more of a success type metric, which is not just one way, but it kind of gives, to your point, it gives credit, and it can be delineated by subgroup. So it could be specific to how are your students with disabilities making gains and growth in growth and achievement. So that's a good call out there. Nice. So we'll come back over to some of these questions to make sure we've pulled over.
My only other one that I was reading when I was reading through this and just trying to play catch up was the tutoring piece.
Yeah.
And my question around that is just, what is the requirement for tutors? Did we address that anywhere of what the expectation is? Is that defined somewhere?
Yeah, so currently we have a strategy. This is trying to find it on the document here, tutoring. So it's legally required as part of last year's Literacy Success Act legislation, and so we have a mandate in place, and it begins at the spring, 1 year from this spring. And so our strategy that we're currently working with using some ESSER funds is called All Core, and it's an acceleration type approach to the tier 1, the standard. So kind of the districts are utilizing during the day for some, after school for some, so kind of some guardrails with research of what we know bears out impact over time, but giving them the space to kind of figure out how that's going and how to make that fit best for their students and their population. But it's really honing in on kind of front loading and helping that just-in-time instruction for students around a particular standard. So it kind of has that feel of going back, but yet not for long, and accelerating back to the thing that they're trying to learn in their core tier 1 instruction. So I think the reason it's here is that it's the funding. So we don't currently have funding tied to that. It's new. So the question was, should there be funding to support that approach and to assist with that legally required legislation?
Just want to make sure the parameters are around a tutor or what that funds are being utilized for, and that is measured in some way, and are benefited.
Yeah. Yep. I think it has. And I think Dr. Ricker was asking earlier, like, how might we also have other measures besides just TCAP? And so to your point there, to measure growth in that all core strategy approach for tutoring, we have a benchmark. They're engaging in a benchmark at least 3 times a year to show that that's helping support the specific standard that they're working on.
Okay.
Good questions. I will put the, just for your context, I'll put the link to that in our chat. It's our TDO website for that. You can peruse. All right. Were there any other policies that we maybe just didn't get to or that you were still kind of chewing on from last time? All right. Well, I think do you feel like that's reflected the things that were front of mind? All right. I will hit the save button on that. I really appreciate each of you. Thank you for all that you have done to review comments and considerations for policy. And I think it's been wonderful to hear your perspectives along the way. We need to do that more often, I think. So please, as you're chewing on anything, continue to weigh in to our TDEOE funding. I just botched that. TDOE.funding email. But thank you. I can't thank you enough for all that you've done in reviewing and providing feedback for us. It's most appreciated.
Dennis, thank you for your leadership and being such a good scribe. I couldn't make that system work nearly as efficiently as you do. So thank you very much.
Very much. Great job.
Well, I appreciate your grace. You have been very kind. So, all
Thank
right.
you for your leadership. And if we accomplish these things, that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, we've certainly had, we've been able to create a framework based on the feedback and thoughts that have been weighed in across each of the 18 subgroups and subcommittees, and then all of the local gatherings, and it's just lots and lots of feedback and comments that you all have been sifting through. So I'm thrilled that we will have recommendations, and we'll just hope from there. The state of the state is the 31st, so we'll keep our ears open for any announcements and moving forward.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.